some musical magic can only be conveyed in a live setting, and boy, do I have some magical live albums for you all today. Hi everyone, I'm Paul Crayson, and you're watching Music Mentions. Today I'm going to discuss my favorite 10 live albums of all time as the second part of a two-part video series. This will be albums number 1 through number 10. In the first part of this video series, I did discuss albums 11 through 20, and I'll put a link to that video at the end of this video in case you want to catch up on those. As I mentioned in the part 1 video, it took me a little while to whittle down this list. This top 10 list probably contains some of your favorites, I would guess, because most of these albums, if not all of them, should be fairly well known to most music fans. These are all live albums that really mean something to me personally and have really informed my journey as a music fan. I really consider these albums all very timeless recordings. Reminder that this ranking is just a snapshot in time. I'm sure if I recorded this video on a different day or even a different year, the ranking and even some of these albums might be a little different. The only exception is number 1, which was a no-brainer for me, but I'll get to that later. As I stated in my part 1 video, this is not going to be a deep dive review of each album. Instead, I'm just going to give you a few details on each and give you a little bit of commentary on each as well. I'll be counting these down from number 10 to number 1. So let's see what I came up with here. Album number 10 is Cheap Tricks at Budokan. This album was released in February of 1979 in the United States, but it was released a little earlier in October of 1978 in Japan. It was recorded over 2 days at Nippon Budokan in Tokyo, Japan, on April 28th and the 30th of 1978. We've got 10 tunes, and it roughly runs at about 42 minutes. This is all killer, no filler. There's some astonishingly great songs on this album. There have been some expanded editions of this album that have been released over the years, but the original release is really the one that probably packs the most punch in the shortest time, and that's the one that I included on my list. This is one of the earliest examples of an album really going viral. This was not intended for the US market, but through radio and through word of mouth, this became just a super international hit for the band. The Japanese audience, which was about 12,000 strong, really screams like a jet engine, and the band is simply on fire here. Robin Zander, who I consider one of the greatest rock and roll vocalists of all time, is in top vocal form, and Rick Nielsen, one of the most unheralded guitar geniuses ever, is also in top form. And of course, we can't forget Bun E. Carlos behind the drum kit. Talk about a fantastic drummer. This band had it all at this time. This recording now is over 45 years old, and it still holds up to this day and is really one of the best examples of how a live album, when done well, can really convey that rock and roll energy almost as if you're in the audience. It's simply fantastic. Album number 9, Bob Dylan and the Royal Albert Hall Concert. This album has quite a storied history behind it. This was only released on October 13th of 1998, but it was recorded on May 17th of 1966. This was highly bootlegged in the years before the official release, and it became known as the Royal Albert Hall Concert, but that was a mistake. This was actually recorded at the Manchester Free Trade Hall in Manchester, England. But regardless, For this official release, they decided to stick with the label of Royal Albert Hall Concert. You can see on the album that they've got Royal Albert Hall in quotes. This is part of Dylan's acclaimed ongoing bootleg series. This one was volume 4 of that bootleg series. It runs about an hour and a half long, and it includes an acoustic set and an electric set. We've got 7 songs that are acoustic, and we've got 8 that are electric. This is also the show at which one of the audience members famously called Dylan Judas for going electric. This was a highly controversial move by Dylan at this time because up until this time, he'd primarily been playing just the acoustic guitar. So this was seen as a real sellout by Dylan and his established fan base at that time. At the time of the official release of this album in 1998, I had been going through a very deep Dylan phase. And so when this album came out, I was super excited. I kept this thing on repeat for many, many months. It's a wonderful historical document, but it's also just a fantastic live performance by Dylan. The acoustic set is stunning with Dylan at top acoustic form, but the electric set is intense and furious. Now, I've got to mention that the band that was supporting Dylan on the electric songs at the time was known as the Hawks. Well, they famously became that great American institution known as the band. Album number 8 is Led Zeppelin and How the West Was Won. This was released on May 27th of 2003. It was recorded on June 25th and 27th of 1972 at the LA Forum and the Long Beach Arena venues, respectively. There are 18 songs here, and the album runs roughly 2.5 hours in length. Some of these tracks were a combination of mixes from performances over both nights of the same song. Regardless, this is the Mighty Zepp at the absolute peak of their live powers. In 1972, they were a real tight live outfit, and really 1972 is known as having the best Led Zeppelin live performances of their career. Their live performances in later years did get a little sloppy, but in 1972, they sounded fantastic, and Jimmy Page was playing accurately and with a lot of heart. The recordings here are excellent. They've got great sound separation. I think they did a really good job on the mixing. Now, when I think about classic live Led Zeppelin, of course, I think about Song Remains the Same. For my money, The Song Remains the Same doesn't hold a candle to How the West Was Won. And I like Song Remains the Same. This album is full-blown powerhouse rock and roll overindulgence and is a must-listen for any self-respecting music fan. Album number 7, Bob Marley Live. This album was released on December 5th of 1975. But it was recorded on July 17th in 1975, with one tune being recorded on July 18th. The venue was the Lyceum Theatre in London, England. There are 8 songs, and the album runs for about 45 minutes. So who doesn't love Bob Marley? He was such a singular reggae genius. And out of all of his live albums, this album is certainly the best and most well-known of those live albums. The live versions of these songs have a little bit of an increased tempo to them, but regardless, Bob, the band, and the audience all sound great. Note that there was a deluxe version of this album that was released in 2016. It includes the full shows from both nights. Although over those 2 nights, many of the songs were repeated. Regardless, if you want a longer live Bob experience, that deluxe release is certainly worth listening to. When I was a teenager, I really got into two studio albums from Bob, and those are Natty Dread and Rastaman Vibration. And I still reach for some Bob Marley whenever I want to kind of inject some positivity into my listening day. This music is really timeless, and I imagine in 100 years from now, people are still going to be listening to this live Bob Marley album. Album number 6 is Talking Heads' Stop Making Sense. This album was released in September of 1984. It was recorded over 4 nights in December of 1983 at the Pantanges Theater in Hollywood, California. This is the soundtrack to one of the greatest concert films of all time. The original album had only 9 songs, but in 1999, there was a 15th year anniversary of this album that expanded the songs to 16. However, earlier this year, in August of 2023, a new version of this album came out that was remastered. It was expanded to the full 18 songs, and it runs for about an hour and a half long. For my money, this is the definitive version that you want to listen to. And by the way, the remastering job that they did on this record is fantastic. This album really sounds alive and fresh today. The sound really leaps out of the speakers. The drums are really forceful and punchy. The sound stage even sounds a little bit expanded to me from the original release. They did a fantastic job here. This album is really one that needs to be played front to back in the order in which it was intended. And the reason for this is the concert starts off very sparingly with Psycho Killer and almost no instrumentation except for a boombox and David Byrne on acoustic guitar. With each successive song, more instruments, more players get on stage until pretty soon you've got an amazing concert experience. This is the Talking Heads at their very best. They are tight, they are funky, especially when Bernie Worrell joins the band on Burning Down the House. Awesome stuff. This is an essential live album that just bristles with the quirkiness that was the Talking Heads, a truly unique sounding American band. Album number 5 is The Who Live at Leeds. This album was released on the 11th of May in 1970 and was recorded on February 14th of 1970 in Leeds, England. There have been several versions of this album that have been released subsequent to that original release in 1970. This album only contains 6 songs, but this is the version, the original version that I put on my list. It's 41 minutes long, and although those expanded versions include many more songs, including most of Tommy, this version is really the one you want to listen to. It's simply a firecracker. This is The Who playing with such an intense energy that you feel like they're going to spontaneously explode on stage. There's always this sense that the band's going to be out of control, but it's what I would probably call controlled chaos on stage. It still packs a punch to this day and really shows you what The Who are capable of doing so early in their careers. This is another record from my youth that I wore out listening to over and over and over again. Album number 4, The Rolling Stones' Get Your Ya-Ya's Out, released on September 4th, 1970. This was recorded in November of 1969 at Madison Square Garden in New York City, but one tune comes from Baltimore, Maryland. We've got 10 songs running at about 47 and a half minutes. Now, this album is the first album to feature the guitarist Mick Taylor, who replaced Brian Jones in the Rolling Stones. This is known as being the best single Rolling Stones live album, and for a good reason. It's simply wonderful. There's this great, sleazy, bluesy, groovy sound, and every one of these songs is a stone cold classic. You really want to check out Midnight Rambler on this recording. It's a great live version of the song. Now, I find this recording not to be very good, meaning technically it's not the best live recording in the world by any means. There are parts of it that kind of sound muddy and run together. Mick Jagger's vocals are a little recessed in the mix in several places. But I also think that's a part of the ongoing charm with this live record. It sounds loose, but also immediate and improvisational. It has a very special vibe, a very special sound to it. And I think most of that credit can be given to the fantastic groove that the Rolling Stones fall into on the entire record. It always makes me smile when I hear some girl in the audience yelling to Mick to play Paint It Black. She says something like, "Paint it black, you devil." But then instead, they go into this amazing version of Sympathy for the Devil. Just classic. Number 3, Grateful Dead, Europe 72. This album was released in November of 1972, and it was recorded in April and May of 1972 on their very famous tour of Europe that year. There are 17 tracks over 3 albums if you're listening to the vinyl version, and the album lasts for about an hour, 50 minutes or so. There was a 50th anniversary release of this album. I would probably recommend listening to that one because it was remastered and it does sound marginally better to my ears. This was the band's 3rd official live release, and it was the last Dead album to feature Ron Pigpen McKernan on keyboards and vocals, as he died in March of 1973. Although there are certainly many Dead albums that could have made this list, I decided to pick Europe 72 because of what it meant for me and what it did for me. Now, I didn't get into the Dead until I was in college. Up until that time, I was just familiar with the radio hits like Truckin'. So when I heard Europe 72, that was the doorway for me into the Grateful Dead rabbit hole, if you will. I was mostly blown away by the sheer quality of the songs and the songwriting. The band, of course, plays fantastic, especially Jerry Garcia and his guitar work really caught my attention. I also really learned to appreciate through this album just the mood and the vibe that only the Grateful Dead can communicate to their listeners. No other band has ever been able to create that atmosphere. After I discovered it, I ended up playing this album over and over and over again, and I learned every song by heart. Now, I love a lot of the later 1970s Dead stuff, but for my money and just personally, 1972, that era and this European tour, for me, is my favorite. Today, when someone asks me what album they should listen to in order to get into the Dead's live music, I always point them to Europe 72. This is a stone cold classic and just another timeless live album. Album number 2, Neil Young and Crazy Horse, Live Rust. This album was released on November 14th of 1979, and it was recorded in October of 1978 as Neil played all over the United States on a tour. There are 16 songs here that run over about an hour and 15 minutes. There are both acoustic and electric tracks here. In 2016, there was a remastered version of this album that is the one I would recommend listening to. This is another live album that hit me really hard when I was a kid. I was maybe 14, 15 years old at the time, and it was really through this live album that I really fell in love with Neil Young. I also remember that many of these songs became radio favorites on FM radio in the late 70s. This is really just a fantastic live album. It's very dynamic, as I mentioned. You've got acoustic and you've got electric. Crazy Horse, which is Neil Young's band here, sounds fantastic. And of course, Neil and that guitar tone and his playing is just magical. I just love the sounds that Neil is able to coax out of his guitar. Listening to this album now brings back some great memories for me, and it really hits me in the feels when I hear it. Well, we've reached number one in my favorite live album of all time. As I mentioned a little earlier in this video, this number one ranking was the only one that for me was a no-brainer. This album has been my favorite live album for many years, if not decades. And this album is the Allman Brothers Band at Fillmore East. And this album was released on July 6th of 1971, and it was recorded on March 12th and 13th of 1971 in New York City at the Fillmore East. There are only 7 songs here, but the album lasts about an hour and 20 minutes long. Now, this was the Allman Brothers Band record that really broke the band to a much wider audience. Of all of the live albums I've included on my list, both in this video and in my part 1 video, this is the best recorded. This was also before Duane Allman died, and his musicianship on this record is simply perfect. There's not a bum note to be found. His touch is flawless. His sense of where the note begins and ends, I can't find any fault with his playing. And that slide playing is just enough to give you goosebumps. And I also have to mention Greg Allman on this album. His playing is fantastic, but his voice, the way that he's able to channel his inner bluesman, is amazing. Here's this white guy that just sounds so authentic to the blues. It's very astonishing. One of the finest blues singers of all time. This is another record that I really didn't get into and really wasn't very aware of when I was a kid in high school. It was only until I got to college that my mind was expanded when I heard this album. I was simply floored, and I still love it to this day. When I was re-listening to this album as I was making this video and preparing for this video, I got goosebumps again listening to this thing. If you don't think that this album doesn't belong in your top 10 or top 20 lists, I'll fight you over that. This album absolutely belongs in everybody's top 10 list. So there you have it, my favorite live albums of all time, my top 10. Were there any surprises here? Was there anything that was just an obvious miss on my part, either in this video or in my previous video? Let me know. I know you will. People are very passionate about their favorite live albums. So let me know, what did I miss? And we'll see what we come up with. Let's have a discussion. Anyway, I'm Paul Crayson. You've been watching Music Mentions. I really appreciate all of you guys for watching my videos. It means a lot to me. If you enjoy this type of content, let me know. Just give me a like, very easy to do. Hit the subscribe if you would, and hit the notifications as well. We'll see you next time.